Welcome to the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. If your job involves working with or influencing people's behavior, this podcast offers invaluable insights into what makes people tick. Through personal interviews that are thoughtful and surprising, we explore the full range of the roots to people smarts that can help you make or break your own career. My name is Marie Gervais, and with a PhD in culture and learning in the workplace and my own cultural journey, I bring the mysteries of human beings at work around the world to you. Through conversations with very diverse people, examining the groups they were born into and the ones they chose to belong to, my podcast takes a deep dive into why people do what they do and how they belong. Hone your skills to manage others and to be a better human being at work with the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. And now for today's episode. Hello, Culture and Leadership Connections podcast listeners. Today, I have a fabulous guest for you. His name is Gary Linnen, and he is the CEO of PeerForward. Mr. Linnen has steered PeerForward's programs for more than a decade, cultivating deep experience in youth development, program innovation, and organizational leadership. You may be wondering what PeerForward is. It is an organization that leverages positive peer influence and provides resources to help low-income youth to access higher education. And he is proof of the concept himself because he came from a low-income place in New York City where he was raised and went to private Quaker school, and then afterwards went to Cornell University where he studied government and is the first person in his family to graduate from a higher education institution. So it's pretty exciting to hear what he's done, what he has to say, a little bit about his family, and I'm looking very much forward to hearing more. And the full name is Gary Zebedine Linnen, which I'm a big fan of names that start with the last letter of the alphabet. And so I am already warm to doing this interview, Gary. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about your family and your growing up years, and just fill us in on some of the personal details.
Sure. So as I mentioned, I am a native New Yorker, born and raised in Spanish Harlem, in particular Washington Projects, which I just love to make sure that I make a connection to because Washington Projects centered me on who I came to be today. My family has a long history from being from Spanish Harlem, where my father, who is from Puerto Rico, and my mother, who's from families from Dunbar, South Carolina. Both families actually met, if you will, on 100th Street within Spanish Harlem. And for anybody that knows the history of Spanish Harlem and 100th Street, there's a lot of rich culture that was grown out of that area. But if you can imagine, it was also a huge area that had a lot of high poverty. But what it did not have was the sense of community. And that's what I loved about growing up in Spanish Harlem. Regardless of the fact that we didn't have that much, we made do with everything that we had to offer. And that's because of the community that our families had put together. So grew up there, had the opportunity to then, go off to some special schools, elementary school and junior high school. And then what I found is that I was actually chosen by the Oliver program to either choose between a private day school and a private boarding school, because I was one of those kids that was Black and Puerto Rican in an impoverished neighborhood that had a unique factor, had great grades, which is cool. So I had the chance to go ahead and leave and go to Weston School, which by far I loved, and then afterwards go to Cornell. I bring all of that up because that really gives you an idea of who I am as a person, because while, yes, I had this chance to go on a different path, I still had to come home. And in coming home, I noticed that there were individuals just as smart as me, if not smarter, that had just the same amount of credentials, but they were not given a chance like I was. And for me, that was fundamentally an issue. And I knew that I had to change that. And so that gives you an idea of who I am as a person, about thinking forward, about being able to help my community, because everyone deserves a proper education.
It seems to me that in the U.S., there's a lot of polarization between people who think that everybody should just pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and others who realize that you can't do that if you don't have bootstraps. What might be simple for a higher income family is extremely difficult for a lower income family. And that if you haven't experienced anything that marginalizes you, you have no empathy for people who live that on a daily basis. So that causes, I imagine, a lot of friction. And I'm just wondering, in your position of CEO of PeerForward, have you experienced that friction?
Yeah, in some capacities. And I would actually just go a little further. Say, I don't know, it's friction in the realm of individuals just don't know. And when you don't know, there are a lot of assumptions that are made about individuals that are from different communities. I have an opportunity to be able to educate individuals about some of the challenges that individuals from low communities have, because when you're not around it, I mean, if you've never had to make pasta, you don't know the recipe for pasta. So we can't make assumptions around it. And so I appreciate the individuals that come and want to support us, or just inquire, like, what does it mean to be from a low community, and knowing that you have a number of different barriers around you. I will say, though, that sometimes there's a misconception that individuals from low communities can't do it. And that's not the case. I think if there's anything, those folks are the most resilient ones. The difference is they don't have access to the same type of opportunities that individuals from high income communities have. And when they do, they rise to the bar. There used to be an assumption like, if you don't have, then you can't do. And that's not the case. They actually can. You just got to give them a chance.
Exactly. Exactly. I once I knew the family fairly well. It's a large family from Sierra Leone. They were Sierra Leonean refugees. And one of the youth in the family, when I first met him, he was 15. And I was talking to him about his goals and his life and what he wanted to do with his life. And he said, something people need to know is that just because you're poor doesn't mean you can't solve the problems of your community.
Exactly.
And I just loved that. It just resonated so strongly with me that it just embedded itself in my memory. And I thought that was so articulate. And I would have loved to put him on a stage with people who thought that just because you've come from a difficult background means that you can't do anything, and hear him speak, because he was wonderful. And everything he explained, he was so wonderful in the way he spoke about things that it just brought a whole new understanding.
No, I mean, I appreciate you mentioning that. And it's even, sometimes we forget that just young adults in general are actually problem solvers, not problems to be solved. And
they are. That's beautiful too. Wait, let me embed that in my memory. Problem solvers, not problems to be solved. Yes. That's great.
Yes, yes.
Sorry, did you want to say more about that before I interrupted you?
That's, individuals that are young, like a lot of times we look at them as it's a deficit. It's not like they have a lot of assets that they bring to the table. And that is something that we have to remind ourselves as adults, that, they can do it. And particularly those from low income communities that have a whole, different space of problems. It doesn't make theirs any worse than somebody from a low income community that is still 16, 17, trying to understand what it means to be a young individual and their own self-identity, because they're built in a culture, in a space where they have to find their own voice in their own community. And so once we equalize that for individuals, that's, building that bridge of young adults can figure it out. You just got to give them the space to do it.
Mm-hmm. I really like this idea. Let me ask you a little bit more about your childhood. Are there a couple of incidents that stand out from your childhood that you think made you into the person you are today?
I think one milestone was actually being chosen to be a part of the Oliver program, because I didn't know. Like, I always went to a talented and gifted school, which was cool, but I didn't know what that meant. I was just like, hey, go to school, read your books. Cool, no problem. But being chosen to be a part of that changed my trajectory. And it was interesting, the day that I had to go to school, I actually got denied from the first school because they said, bring your best outfit. And for me, my best outfit was a pair of light jeans and a gray sweater. I didn't know that I needed a suit. And I was like, I don't own a suit. And so I got denied because I didn't have the clothes, if you will, to be able to even be a part of the equation. And then, with the Oliver program, they actually took me to Foot Locker for the very first time to actually measure my feet. Those are like those milestones of where I didn't know that it actually meant something, because we had a big community where clothes didn't mean anything for us because I had family. But the moment I was actually taken out of my community and put into another world where people start, judging you by the way that you look, the way that you talk, that changed the trajectory, because I knew now that I needed to make sure that I show up a different way by being authentic in who I am. So I did get to a space where I started being rebellious of like, you're not going to tell me who I am as an individual. Like, I love who I am. They're like, well, it's funny. They was like, I used to say ax versus ask. And I'm like, why are you trying to correct the way that I talk? Like, that's how we do. And so it was moments like that that actually changed the way, because it helped to reinforce the importance of my identity and my culture and how I grew up, to not conform to what society said I needed to be. Because I felt as if, as long as I stay true to myself, I would show up and be the best that I can. And that's the only way that others will be able to understand that uniqueness is beautiful.
Well, that shows a lot of resilience. And maybe also you had a strong sense of self based on the love and support of your family. Am I on the right track?
You are, yeah, because I mean, we had a strong family unit that always said, stand up for yourself. Don't let your voice be, muddled in the waters because you are a Linnen and you're a Melendez. At the end of the day, we're strong in this community. And so you will show up that way anywhere else you go.
That's a great message to hear and to see around you.
Yes.
And then that gave you the courage to go into the world and see that there were contrasts, that people might be looking at you from a different standard, but you could still be yourself within that.
I had to find myself in that because, I mean, the reality is that when the culture shock of going into a new environment that you're not used to, you go into this experience of keep my head down, let me just go ahead and pass through this. But then the only way I was able to get through it is I had to find other individuals that I can relate to build a community that I was now taken away from. And that community is by finding individuals that, shared the same purpose, the same theme, and shared experiences to say, hey, I know I'm not going crazy. Are you going crazy? Oh, no. So how do we figure out to do this together? And I'll never forget getting to Westtown and being, one of the very few Black and Puerto Rican individuals in the school that was predominantly white. We had to find a way to make sure that our voice can still be heard, because it can get drowned when you're not part of the majority.
That's for sure. And the temptation to keep your head down and be invisible is really strong.
Yeah, the imposter syndrome, like, why am I here? I'll never forget one day when a student told me, he said, my father's paying your tuition. Wait.
What an entitled, snotty comment.
Yeah, but in comments like that and the communities that we came from, we learned how to manage that. Like, how do you turn, because I can easily react, but how do you respond to it in a way that shows that you're resilient and you're not going to allow that to determine your future?
So how did you respond to that?
I laughed and I was like, okay, great. For me, it was a joke at that moment. But the way in which that I responded was by showing that, guess what? Look at my grades and look at yours.
Mm-hmm.
So at the end of the day, thank you.
Thank you. I'm here because I deserve to be here.
Exactly.
Just saying. That's great. So what about as a young adult? Anything that stands out that you think was formative?
So there's this one thing about your culture of growing up from a particular environment and being shifted. The other one is understanding who I was as an individual. So right around 16, 17, everyone's trying to figure out what their identity is. And I actually had a really challenging time of being able to accept that I was actually gay. And I was like, hold on, what does that mean? And how do you grow up in an environment where you didn't want anybody to know that? And it literally took 30 years to be able to even say that out loud right now, because that helped form my identity. But the question is, like, that's a long journey on how do you be okay with that being who you are and defining that. And so that was a milestone at 16 when I recognized it, but I knew that it would take a long time for me to be able to articulate it in a way where I don't feel ashamed.
Yeah. And in a way where it wasn't dangerous for you to articulate it.
Definitely a huge milestone for me in my young adults during the high school time. And then, I would say during college, it's when I got to a space where I was too Black to be Puerto Rican and too Puerto Rican to be Black, being able to stand, but what does that mean to be both? In a space where, individuals are trying to understand who they are and define, all the different elements that they are.
It is tough to be straddling different worlds when you're a young person and you're trying to find points of commonality and human interests that you can make friends with, and at the same time maintain your sense of uniqueness and pride in that uniqueness. It's a hard journey, isn't it?
It is. But what makes it better is when you find individuals that help you, because a lot of your peers are going through the exact same thing.
Exactly. They're just scared to say anything about it.
It's that part right there. And I think that's why I'm appreciative of those milestones, because it allowed our friends to be able to look around and say, I don't need to tell you, but that I'm going through something. And so I just need you to walk with me. And that's what's been interesting. And what I learned from high school, the beauty about Quakerism, when you actually just can build community, and you don't have to tell your entire truth, but people know your truth.
Yes, very nicely said. So people are born into a context, which you've already explained in some detail, but I think probably we could add a bit more detail to that because we're not conscious of the cultures that we're born into. So you're born into Black Puerto Rican family in a particular landscape, in a low income landscape, but around you there were many other things. And you started to talk about that. That's not everything that you were, but it did influence you because you were born into it and you didn't really have a choice, right? So what would you say stood out for you that caused you to develop your own sense of leadership and culture from those cultures that you were born into? And that can also be urban versus rural, or, it can also be whether you're close to a large body of water or close to a mountain. Like those things also affect people's sense of culture and leadership. Your religion could also affect it, language, whatever stands out for you.
Definitely. I'm like, it's as a non-religious person. However, Quakerism, the principles of Quakerism actually stood out to me, which was about regardless of who you are, there's, turn to like there's a higher being that's around to be able to help drive individuals. That has been centered in how I approach individuals. But then also this sense of urgency about community development, community organizing of I want everybody to be good and everybody to have a fair chance. And that is actually help formalize my leadership skills because, as running an organization, you're looking at everybody that comes from different communities, regardless of your income, your race, your gender, sexual orientation, any of those pieces, you're still individuals trying to figure out your path. And a lot of times all you want to do is be heard and seen. And so part of like what I've learned over the years and how I formalized my leadership skill is being able to tap into that because there were so many instances where I was not heard or seen. And I wore this mask of I got it because I had to have it, but I didn't have it all. Like there were days I didn't know how I was going to pass a class or how I was going to pay a bill or where I was going to live. But I knew I had to wear this mask of showing that I'm showing up because that's how we were built. But the moment I start becoming vulnerable, allowed me to see it in a different perspective.
So initially you're saying like stand and deliver and put on the happy face and just go do it was what you came from. But then you learned yourself into being vulnerable in the right context, I imagine, because you can't be vulnerable all the time. It's really popular to talk about vulnerability, but there's a lot of instances where you should not be vulnerable. Right. So like, for example, you talked about knowing that you were gay when you were a teen and you weren't going to go broadcast that from the top of a mountain. It could have resulted in you being seriously harmed or killed. Right. So how did you negotiate that piece of stand and deliver and then also being vulnerable?
Well, I think it's one, owning your truth and knowing exactly to your point, like growing up in the projects, you know exactly how to move. Like you just don't go and just be, right? You have to make sure that you're being intentional about your movements. And that is the same way in which intentional about what I share with individuals, right? Because vulnerable for me doesn't necessarily mean that you express it to everyone else. It means being vulnerable with yourself to acknowledge where you are as an individual and what are you going to do about it, right? And so if I'm not feeling good or if I don't feel worthy enough, it's a conversation I'm having with myself. And what do I need to do to be able to get out of that space? That is where there needs to be a balance, right? Because you can't always say that to somebody because somebody may perceive you as being weak or perceive you as not having it together. And that will have you react in a certain type of way. And so I had to go through a training of being able to understand, like, how do you balance vulnerability and leveraging your armor to be able to deal with life? Because we all have an armor that we wear. And the question is, like, when am I willing to take the armor off? When do I need to go ahead and double up on it?
I like the way you said that vulnerability is more about telling yourself or admitting to yourself that you don't feel confident or that you're having something that you feel inadequate about. It's more about being about self-honesty. I think that's what you said.
Yeah, it's being truthful with yourself. A lot of times, I think we've been conditioned to say it's going to be okay. But sometimes you got to tell yourself, actually, I don't feel okay today. And that is okay.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I've learned in my leadership style, particularly when running an organization. Like, you got people are going through their own journey. You got to allow people to have that space to reflect so that they can get up and be their best selves.
Space to reflect is really important.
Yes, correct.
So that's something that you learned later. So I'm thinking, were you always reflective or is that something that you developed later on?
No, I was a doer. I was just like Nike, just do it. Because problem solving, I was fine. But it took a mentor of mine to tell me, like, you need to sit back and reflect because you're running at a pace where you're going to get tired one day. And as a young adult, you don't see it, but I'm telling you, you're going to get tired because you can't sprint for your entire life. Like, there's not a sprinter that can do that. And so when do you stop, reflect, rebuild, pour into your cup, and then go back out?
Was just do it a kind of constant orientation because you need to do that to survive and also to keep up the front?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely to survive. I mean, we have a natural instinct of like, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we are all good, if you will. And I've naturally been a just do it, like get it done. Like if you see it, I'm a natural problem solver. So I'm like, forget it. Like my mind works like a Tetris game. Like I'm going to figure it out. Always have. But sometimes figuring out, you forget that you need to figure out yourself too.
That leads me to the question about temperament and personality. So temperament you're born with, and then social context will form it more. And then personality is how you overcame or didn't overcome obstacles and opportunities in your life. So what did you start out with temperament wise, and what did you grow into or become later personality wise?
It was that. So I would still lead with the just do it, which means like I have everything under control. That's always been my temperament. And I'm good because things have moved so quickly and nothing has fallen, if you will, figuratively, right? And so I was able to juggle many tasks. But it wasn't until probably 6, 7 years ago that I finally found that you're getting to a point where you're juggling a little bit too much and you need to sit back and say, who am I trying to be and where am I trying to go? Because this running at that pace is it's not sustainable. And then that's when I, through this experience of being able to reflect and own my truth, and actually what I was going to say, like marry my truth, that has allowed me to think differently on how I approach, things going forward. Because I need to be my best self. And if I'm not my best self, I'm actually harming other individuals when you're not your best self because they're looking for me to be my best self. So what do I need to do to be able to step back so I can show up as that?
What does that mean to marry your truth?
To know when you're feeling great, to know when you're feeling down, to know when you don't actually have all the answers and being able to reach out for help.
So you learned to be reflective, to reach out for help, and to be more honest with yourself about who you were and what your strengths were?
Yeah, so that because individuals, particularly in a leadership position, individuals are looking up to you. And if you're not being true to yourself, they'll see that. Like particularly young adults, like they know when you're lying. They see straight through you. Like, your eyes are the windows to your soul and they see that. And if you're not being human, then they can't trust you. And I think in this work that we do, particularly as leaders, you have to be able to build trust with confidence. And the only way that I've found that's worked for me is being true to myself and owning my truths, but also acknowledging where, the confidence that I have behind it, but as well as how do you build up others and you're seeing in their truth.
Right. Being oriented towards the success of others.
Correct. Because it goes back to what I was mentioning, like I've always been about community and how do we make sure in order to be able to create a sense of community and build from there, like you have to be able to know who you are, how you show up, and how do you support others when they are showing up in the best that they got.
So you learned resilience and how to stand and deliver and a whole lot of other things from the cultures you were born into. I just wanted to ask you anything specifically Puerto Rican that stands out that you could also add to that mix?
Yeah. Celebration.
Yeah.
Celebration is huge for us. Like family connections is huge because if there's anything about my Puerto Rican side and even my Black side, it's like we love to eat and we love music. We love to party, but that's because we love to celebrate the connections that we all have with each other. There's a sense of like family that is deeply inbred in like this matriarch way of being that we always need to make sure that we have each other's back. And I just love, that piece around it. Now, granted, my Spanish is limited, which is another because I grew up in Spanish Harlem, but that never stopped my grandmother and I from being able to communicate with each other when she talked 90% Spanish and mine's 90% English.
Yeah, because the heart still communicates.
Correct.
And so as you grew into your adult life, what things have you adopted, would you say, culturally that are different? Because you were associated with different groups. You are identifying with different groups. Some of them can be professional, hobby. it can be a whole variety of different influences in your life. What would you say are some of the stronger influences now?
Influence in respect to individuals influencing, or what do I stand?
No, I would say groups that you're associating with that have affected your sense of culture and your sense of leadership.
Oh, definitely. I would say the LGBTQ community has, because of the learnings I've gotten since, the age of 16, for certain. Um, the sense of resiliency, the sense of connections, brotherhood, sisterhood, the fact that, we compete against each other, in a good way because we know how hard it is to show up when we're in, the largest society. So that's one. One, my family by far, because they've always been the most accepting of when things are great and when things are not so great, regardless of who I am, and those would be the two that stand out by far, like how my family and I build off of community and living your truth, stand by your word. And then the resiliency from the LGBTQ community of like, hey, I know what it means to have people look at you left. And that's not what I'm going to go ahead and stand for. And so I'm not the one to go and say, yes, hi, I'm gay black male. I'm like, no, that's not me. Actually, I'm built differently. But you won't talk about a gay black male in front of me and me not say anything about it.
Right, right. It reminds me of I can't remember who said this, but it was a woman who was talking about a book that she'd written. At any rate, she said, I want to be seen as a woman, but I don't want to walk into the room and everyone jumps up and goes, look, a woman.
Exactly. Yeah. I love that. I love that analogy. It's the same. I mean, that's part of the cult, like what we were trained in when you're in this privileged experience of like how to show up at the workforce. Same way, right? I'm like, the labels I don't need. Like, who I am is Gary Zebedee Linnen that shows up and brings his best self. That is Black and Puerto Rican from Spanish Harlem that has all of these different beautiful aspects about him. Like, that's the elements that we need to lead with, and being able to identify those, and not one is better than the other. Like, I am a melting pot of all of New York City.
Right, right.
And all these different components that has built who I am right now. And so as I'm raising two beautiful young ones, that's 2 and 1, I want them to be able to show up as their best selves, like show up as, what they've been named and who they are, and let, society, let all of the different environmental factors help shape them into who they are. And they're going to be beautiful, resilient young women that's about to take over the world.
That's great. I love it. So can you think of a moment when you experienced cognitive dissonance? You spoke about one, which was when you were going to the Quaker high school called Westtown, and how it was just sort of a little bit of a shock to the system to go, whoa, people are looking at me differently, and they're expecting different things from me than I would have experienced. Have there been other moments like that in your life when you felt this is the way I do things is not the way other people do things?
Honestly, as a Black Puerto Rican man, that's every day. Where we're still getting experiences of that. Even as a CEO and running this beautiful organization, there's this wait and see attitude from the field of like, can you produce? And again, from my just do it mindset, I'm like, yes, I can. But yes, that feeling of, oh, they don't think I can actually do it. It gets you to a place of like, I can show you better than I can tell you. And so I think there's every iteration of milestones of our lives, what it actually means to be a guy raising 2 little girls by myself with the support of my mother. People are looking like, don't know if you can do that. And so there's a sense of it makes you question who you are. But back to that vulnerability piece, you have to get back to reminding yourself of like, you know what? You've gotten through many other challenges throughout your life, whether that was in high school of not feeling worthy enough and putting my head down, whether it was in college of not feeling smart enough because I got there and, high school was a breeze, but college was challenging for me, which led to me not wanting to apply to grad school because I didn't think I was smart enough. And then getting into the workforce where everything was like game, but now I am like the person that everyone's paying attention to. And what's that feeling of when you got to raise your own individual family as well as the family of the organization. And people are looking like, can you do it?
You're right. It's cognitive dissonance every second of the day.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the thing that stands out for me is just this whole having to prove yourself over and over again. I've spoken to so many people who said they're sick and tired of that. It's like, doesn't my story already show that I can do this? Why do I need to prove myself to you? What is it that makes you think I'm inherently deficit? This is not who I am, and you haven't seen any evidence of it. It's just tiring, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It stretches the brain when we just want to do great things. Even with our young adults, it's, when I talked about problem solvers versus problems to be solved, that deficit mindset permeates across so many different communities, even when, your resume may say something. And it's like, how do we get past that to think of like, what are the assets that individuals are bringing? And, culture, lived experiences sometimes have individuals believing things about folks that when they show up and you having to prove yourself or just be, it's strenuous.
For sure, strenuous. So what would you like to promote? Do you want to talk a little bit about PeerForward some more? Because I don't think I've asked you many questions about that. And anything else you'd like to promote? This is your soapbox moment, so go for it.
Yeah, so I definitely want to go ahead and promote PeerForward because PeerForward's work that we're doing resonates with my experience as well as the 500,000 students that we've supported over the last 25 years. And so PeerForward is a national nonprofit that works with high schools and colleges to get individuals from low-income communities to and through college. So lived experiences that I'm talking about that are still battling this today, but they show up as resilient individuals because the individuals that are part of the program are the most influential folks in their building. So we train and mobilize an influential student, regardless of their grades, to be able to help their friend get to and through. And by doing that, they build communities and connections to get people to understand their why so that they can actually persist throughout high school and college, which all of us, I'm sure, can attest to, can be an interesting journey. So I want to make sure that people understand the value that PeerForward is bringing. What we're doing in college, we're seeing a 71% higher completion rate for folks that are participating here versus for those that are not in those several colleges. And in high school, we've, again, gotten more than 500,000 students over the years into college, which is phenomenal. So definitely check us out, www.peerforward.org. At the end of the day, it's about friends helping friends. And I want to make sure that individuals pay close attention to it.
Because there have been a lot of failed projects where people just remove somebody from their community, throw them into some strange environment where they still perform well academically, but afterwards they feel like a fish out of water, and doesn't mean they can move forward in their lives because they didn't have any community, they didn't have any friends, and they weren't able to bring others into that situation in a way that they could be successful. It seems to me that PeerForward has solved that problem.
Yes, I mean, we tapped into the most simplest thing, which we all can resonate. Like, who do you call when things are down or when you need support? A friend, somebody that you actually have a relationship with. Parents, we know what it means when you're raising a child. We can say something to a child until we're blue in the face. The moment their best friend says it's okay, it all of a sudden goes and they're like, yes, I'll do it. And I know I said, I just told you that. But the friend said it, validates it. And so that has been the essence of what we do. It's getting people to tap into themselves, understanding the power of their voice and being able to help others that they want to move along with them.
You know, what you just said reminded me of one of my grandsons who, when he was little, his mother was trying her darndest to get him to eat vegetables, and he wouldn't eat vegetables. And she's a great cook and everything, and he wouldn't eat vegetables. And they went to a friend's house, and that friend happened to live on a farm. And so the friend and my grandson went out into the garden, and the friend started picking the vegetables and eating them and said, this is so good. You want to taste it. And from then on, he was like a huge vegetable fan. And it was just because his friend said, this is so good. You want to taste it. And then his brother had a similar experience where they were sitting down and eating something. And his friend said, mustard. Do you like it? And my grandson went, why would I like something that looks yellow and gross? And he said, taste it. It's my favorite topping. And from then on, he was a mustard fan. I know it's just really simplistic in comparison to what you're talking about, but it really does show still the influence, because people's tastes don't change that easily. When they're children, they're a little bit more malleable. But if you grow up with beans and rice, then it's pretty hard to expand your palate, right? But as a kid comes and says to you, this is mustard, it's awesome, give it a taste, and you're little, you're
right?
likely to do it, right? So you're capitalizing on that flexibility and all that influence of youth on each other to be a positive peer influence.
That's what's the answer, because a lot of times we focus on negative peer pressure, like, oh my goodness, people, their friends are going to get them into, doing the most craziest things. We recognize how that works. And what we've learned is like, just invert it. Peers influence peers, whether it's either do drugs, which we don't want them to do. How do you invert it to be positive? And so
Yeah.
it's the same premise. It's just changing the conversations that they're having. And for me, I'm like, that's how we like, it's actually really simple because we do it every day. Even as adults, like we lean into our peers, our mentors. It's something that is never going to go away. The question is like, how do you just provide structure around it so that it's a much more intentional conversation to produce positive outcomes?
Yeah. What you pay attention to grows. So if you're paying attention to the positive influence of peers, it's going to keep growing.
Yes.
Yeah. And if you just keep warning about, oh, stay away from this and stay away from that negative influence, then basically people will just be drawn into it. They don't see any alternative.
Correct.
So if people contact you or want to work with you or hire you, or if you hire people to work with you, what brings out the best in Gary? What makes Gary be at his best self at work?
The ability to smile and just be happy. Like it's that to me, like I have an open door policy at work. And as long as individuals are just being upfront about, their experiences, that makes me happy. Because at the end of the day, I just want to make sure everybody else is good. I'm just a natural nurturer. And I show up that way. And then also the ability just to go ahead and just be me. Like when I'm having challenges with, a 1 and 2 year old that's screaming in the back, people are okay with that, because it shows me just being, human. Humanality goes a long way at PeerForward. And that's why, the majority of we haven't had anybody during COVID leave.
Pretty good testament to the strength of the program.
Yes. Well, I mean, the strength of the culture that we built, because regardless, I don't lead with being a leader in terms of leading as a CEO. My job is to make sure that I'm empowering my staff members to be the best that they can be. And by doing that, that was always going to get the best outcomes. And that's how I feel great, because they're feeling great. And if they're not good, I'm not good. So that's how I like to lead with.
Yeah, the strength of the culture is significantly more important than the strength of any program, because the strength of a program disappears, but the strength of the culture endures.
Yes, agreed.
Well, is there anything else that you would like to say before we end the interview today?
Just that, check us out. Like we're doing a lot of great things. Again, we're a national organization working in many of the major cities and rural communities. And at the end of the day, young adults are the individuals that are going to change what's going to happen over the future. And we got to start paying attention to them. And if we don't, we're going to miss the mark. So that's why PeerForward is, staying at the front and center of it, through supporting individuals that are currently in the program, and even our alumni base that are currently, in college and going to the workforce world. But start paying attention to the young ones. There are a lot of interesting things that they can teach us, and you can teach them.
That's a wonderful thing to end with. Thank you so much. I really appreciated the interview, and thank you so much for your time and your insightful comments.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Gary Zebedine Linnen is a positive force of energy and optimism. His rise through difficult circumstances taught him to leverage relationships to achieve his potential, be true to himself, and nourish the drive to do the same of others. Devoting his energies to the uplift of youth through the organization PeerForward, Gary helps youth build strong peer relationships and access academic opportunities that would otherwise be unattainable without support and resources. Gary knows how to believe in youth as problem solvers, not problems to be solved. From his strong family roots in Spanish Harlem, Washington, to the many mentors along the way, he learned that the path to hone his natural strengths and to build new ones is solidarity. Gary is living proof that when we believe in each other and see youth for the inspiring powerhouses they truly are, greatness is born. Remember to subscribe to the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast so you get notifications of all the new episodes. Check out the show notes for Gary's contact information while you're there. Take a minute to rate and review the podcast or buy me a coffee by clicking on the links. Thank you for listening. And may Culture and Leadership Connections continue to guide and inspire your day. Want to show some appreciation? You can buy me a coffee. What? How do you buy a coffee For a podcast owner, well, there's a way. Let me explain. You go to buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. That's spelled MarieGervais. So it's buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. And when you go to that website, what's going to happen is you'll get a chance to click on 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 cups of coffee at $5 a piece to help contribute to the cost of the podcast. And yes, it's $5 for a cup of coffee because it's quality coffee for a quality podcast. So I hope you will contribute and you'll help us to reduce the costs of the podcast by going to buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. Thank you in advance for your generous contribution.